Before we go to Lewis's actual account of language use, we need to first see that it involves a slight modification to the theory of convention that we saw last week. The first thing that we need to observe is that, so we talked about regularities in action, i.e. people acting in a particular way in general whenever a certain situation arises. But regularities can occur not just in action, but also in belief. Here's just a really simple example. Here's a regularity in how I believe things. If people tell me it's raining, then I come to believe it's raining. That's a regularity in belief that applies to me. So there can be regularities in action as well as regularities in belief. This is important because, remember, the lesson of thinking about signaling games seems to suggest that we need to actually be thinking about regularities of belief on the part of the audience rather than regularities in action. The problem is that, as we stated it before, it's not really clear that Lewis's definition of a convention actually accommodates regularities in belief. Let's take a closer look at why that would be. On Lewis's original definition of a convention, the reasons for doing something are exclusively practical. The reason for playing your part in the coordination equilibrium is because that's a desirable thing for you to do given what everybody else is doing. It's what you should do given that everybody else is conforming to the regularity. But this isn't really how we should think about belief as working. The sense of reason to do something here is practical. Everybody else is doing something gives you a practical reason to act in a certain kind of way. The problem is that when it comes to belief, it doesn't look like that's necessarily how we want to think about belief. We don't really choose how to believe things. We just either do believe it or we don't believe it based on our assessment of the evidence. Believing something at will so while a few people maybe think that that's something you can do, most people think it's not something you can do, that you can't just believe something at will. So the idea that convention is driven by practical reasons to do something is going to founder when it comes to the case of belief. If you can't choose how to believe things, then how are there going to even be practical reasons for you to believe things? Really what we need is some accommodation for the fact that when it comes to belief, what motivates us is not practical reasons, but epistemic reasons. What moves us to believe certain things is just what the evidence supports and not what our practical reasons may or may not be. So if we want to extend the account of convention to apply to regularities not just in action but also in belief, we need to make some kind of accommodation for this. We need to allow for the fact that the reasons for believing certain things are very different from the kinds of reasons that motivate action. Reasons for belief are epistemic, reasons for action are practical. Originally, Lewis, in the final chapter of Convention, for this reason, gave a very different picture of what's going on in conventional use of language than the one he gives in Languages and Language. And that's because he didn't see that actually really all that's needed is a small tweak here. Because as a matter of fact, the original definition of convention was specifically about practical reasons. But this is maybe just a mistake and not necessarily a part of the proposal that's really essential. So what Lewis does in Languages and Language is he just slightly tweaks the definition of a convention so that the reasons for acting or the reasons for conforming to the regularity, be it either in action or in belief, can be either epistemic or practical. For this reason, he ends up sort of dropping talk of the coordination equilibrium that we talked about last time, but the essential idea is still there. On Lewis's new definition of a convention, a regularity R, be that either a regularity in action or belief, or both, a combined regularity in action and belief, that a regularity like that in a population gets to be a convention just in case 6 conditions hold. Firstly, it has to be that everybody conforms to the convention. So everybody is actually doing their part in making R be the regularity that actually holds. Secondly, everybody believes that everybody else is conforming to R. Thirdly, believing that everybody else is conforming to R gives you decisive reason to conform to it. Now that kind of reason could take one of two forms. It could be a practical reason, if conforming to it in this situation for you means doing something, or it could be an epistemic reason, if in this particular situation conforming to the regularity means believing something. So depending on what it takes to be conforming, either acting or believing, you have either a practical reason to play your part or an epistemic reason to play your part. That's the third condition. The fourth condition is that everybody prefers general conformity to the regularity R to slightly less than general conformity. This condition and the last one are basically the condition from before, that what you're doing has to be a coordination equilibrium. Because the first, so condition 3 says that you have decisive reason to do your part, and also you prefer everybody to be doing their part to almost everybody playing their part. So that's conditions 3 and 4. Condition 5 is that R is not the only regularity with the above properties. So remember before we said in a coordination game, it's essential to have two equilibria, because if there is only just one, then there's no problem that you're trying to coordinate for. It's just obvious how you should coordinate. That's again reflected in conventions. We said last time, for something to be convention, it has to be that you've settled the regularity takes the form of one of these possible coordination equilibrium. So this is just the familiar condition from before, that it's not the only one you could have followed that had the properties that we just mentioned. And finally, the last condition, condition number 6, is the condition that conditions 1 through 5 are common knowledge to hold. We talked a lot about that last time and what that means and why Lewis thinks it's necessary, but we're not going to talk about it anymore for today. So that's Lewis's new definition of a convention. Unlike the old definition, it allows for regularities in belief as well as regularities in action, or regularities in action and belief, a kind of combined regularity, to be conventions. That wasn't possible on the old one. On the old one, conventions could only be regularities in action. Since we want to work up to a conventional account of language, we need to extend it to account for the case of belief. That's what the example of the signaling game showed us. So now we have this slightly more liberal account of what a convention is, and we can move forward and apply it to a theory of language use.